Global population growth, net zero targets, and declining biodiversity are three interconnected challenges facing our agricultural industry. How can farmers create an uplift in production to meet demand, improve their financial performance and business resilience, while reducing their impact on the natural environment? Please welcome to the aquarium your panellists for this session.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've had a terrific time so far today. I know that I've really enjoyed hearing some fantastic speakers who are really sharing some thought-provoking messages. My name is Natasha Greenwood, and I'm General Manager of Agribusiness at the Commonwealth Bank. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting our next conversation, where we're going to be talking about how agriculture is leaning into transition and is navigating a pathway to a lower carbon future. Why am I so excited to be talking about ag? Because ag is the most innovative, dynamic, thriving, prosperous sector that is at the intersection of three incredibly important global challenges. How do we produce more? We need to feed and clothe a growing global population. But at the same time, we need to emit less and sequester carbon. And we also need to rebuild natural capital and enhance biodiversity. I would argue that agriculture is uniquely placed to be able to tackle all three of these issues and to do so successfully. So today we're going to be hearing from three fantastic speakers who are going to be sharing their insights about how ag is working to tackle three of the most important, complex and challenging situations facing the globe today. So please join me in welcoming Hammond from Landcare Australia, Bobby Miller from Ruminati, and Mark Gubbins from Coolana Rural. Please join me on stage. Well, thank you so much. It's terrific to have all of you here. And I'm going to start by asking each of our panellists to tell you a little bit about themselves so that they can share a little bit of their story and you get to know them a little bit better. So I'm going to start with you, Ange, and we'd love to hear a little bit about your background and why you think this is such an important topic today in terms of how we're supporting farmers achieve both economic and environmental outcomes and unlocking that new triple bottom line of productivity, profitability and sustainability.
Thanks, Tash. Well, as you said before, our industry is very well placed at the moment just to support our world going forward as far as managing our land better. My background is that I've been working in ag for over 30 years now. I grew up on a property on the New South Wales-Queensland border out near a place called Lightning Ridge. Across the border from there, a little place called Hebel, and a 70,000 acre property. And the thing with growing up on the land where I grew up was very isolated, but also we dealt with, I guess, weather on a daily basis, because where I come from, it's 12 inches of rain a year, which is not very much. We're also on 4 rivers, so if it wasn't a flood, which covered about 50,000 acres of our property, it was a drought. But they were all good things. So the floods were great because we had a lot of subsoil moisture for a couple of years afterwards to grow feed. So the rain from the sky wasn't as big a factor as the floods were, and then droughts. So I grew up out there and loved the land. We were very lucky growing up on the land. It was like the perfect place to grow up. Didn't seem to be any gender problems out there when I was growing up. As kids, we were just kids. So I can break a horse and train a dog and strain a fence, and I got my HR licence when I was 18 because Dad said you need to deliver some rams for me. So you sort of just do all those things and learn to cope. So when you grow up on the land, you learn to splint a dog. You know, a dog gets a broken leg, you have to splint that leg with a bit of plaster of Paris. You learn to give a needle to an animal, you learn to muster, you learn to do all of those things. So I then went to university at Armidale and did rural science, did my degree, and I've worked in ag ever since. Now, the thing about ag is that generally we love the land. That's why we work on it. So in the 30 years that I've been working in ag, when I first started, the first conference I went to, which was a similar size to this, there was 2 of us in the room. Tash, 2 women. in the room. There's about 1,000 people at the conference, and so this is back in the very early 90s. And so it was an interesting time where people were like, it's a good industry, but it was almost like, oh, she's a girl, would she really be able to? And then to their credit, the whole industry was like, if you're having a go, they were like, oh, she's having a go, she's a girl, she can do it, we'll give her, we'll support her to do it. So it was 30 years ago, the industry was slightly different. The exciting thing now is that we're probably getting more young women into our industry at a consultative level than young men in some way. So it's really balanced the gender difference in our industry, which is great. And yeah, so when you've got a passion for the land, when I was at uni, we learned about Landcare because it was a very new thing in Australia. I was at uni in the early 90s and Landcare only had started in the late 80s. And it was like, as an agricultural person, like, this is really cool. The premise of Landcare that we were taught was that it was about bringing groups of producers together to better manage the land, to work with their production systems, but also work with the environment. So it's been a dream for me after years of working in the industry with a few different organisations to come and work for Landcare and manage the Landcare Ag program. We're at a really nice point where we're working with great organisations like Ruminati that Bob works with that are helping producers collect information and data and apply that to what they do on the land so they can monitor what they do, measure what they do, and always be constantly aware of what they're doing and improve their landscape as they continue to produce the food and fibre that we need for our population. Is that enough, Tash?
Absolutely, Ange, and I think what's really interesting about some of the things that you've touched on there, deep farming background, real life knowledge and experience to be able to bring to the communities that you work with. And I'm going to be really excited to hear shortly some of the work that Landcare Australia is doing, but particularly through the Landcare farming work that you're doing and some of the insights that you're hearing. Bobby, I'm going to move to you now. Tell us a little bit about the Bobby Miller story.
The Bobby Miller story. Okay, I come from a rural family background-wise. My mother grew up on a sheep station in Cunnamulla, which is in central West Queensland. Dad was a dairy farmer at Gerringong when there used to be dairy farms at Gerringong. And I actually grew up in Sydney though, born and raised in Sydney, and our family moved back to the country 20 years ago. I had about 8 or 9 year career in commercial real estate before moving back to the farm about 12 years ago. And the start of the third career change into a tech company out of beef production was about 2.5, 3 years ago, when we saw this sort of emerging gap between where the industry was going in setting emissions targets and making some pretty ambitious commitments and what was happening on farm. And what we'd learnt that most of the emissions in the food and fibre supply chain were generated on farm. And we just saw a big gap that wasn't being addressed there in helping farmers to gather their data, to measure, to report. And so I guess Ruminati's been to bringing together my experience in the corporate world and then 12 years on the farm together to help try and solve this problem for farmers. And for you, Tash.
Well, look, we're going to be really excited to hear a little bit more about what Ruminati is doing to really help support farmers as we move through transition. And before we get to that, though, I'd love to get to know a little bit more about Mark. I've had the absolute privilege of being on Mark's property at Coolana. And I'll let Mark tell the story, but it's wonderful to have you here, Mark. So love for you to share a little bit with our audience, a little bit about your background and what you're doing in southwest Victoria.
Thanks, Tash, and hello, everyone. I'll start off by saying I'm a generational farmer, but what does that mean? Effectively, I've been farming for some generations in a family, probably 5 in total, but 3 where I live. So, and I've got a 4th one that's joined me now. The Wedge-tailed ag is part of a new business to set up my family in the next generation, splitting the place in half. We farm sheep and cattle in Western Victoria, about an hour north of Warrnambool, and also on the Coorong in South Australia. And the Coorong, for those that don't know where it is pretty well where the Murray runs into the ocean. Very different, fundamentally different farming countries, but very good for our business. I just want to do a bit of history that will give you a bit of a picture of our farm, and we talk about natural capital and things like that. It'll take you back to what I think the natural capital was that we started with. And my grandfather bought Coolana in 1930. It was 3,000 acres, 7 paddocks, overrun with rabbits and deemed unviable. It's now, that particular block's 3 times the size. It's got, I can't remember how many paddocks, 100, to do the job it does. And it produces beef and lamb for basically you with all the other producers in the country for on your plates. But if I go back to that block, when he first bought it, deemed unviable, then the Depression hit, then World War II, it would have been some pretty tough times, and they came back from the war, and I sort of want to talk to about the environment we created on these farms, and the early plantings they did were sugar gum plantations for shelter and for firewood, because that's all you had in those days, and then cypress trees, miles and miles of cypress trees for shelter. Not the sort of tree you'd plant now, but in those days that's what they planted. And they've nearly come to their life now, and we're having to replace those because of a thing called false caper, a virus that kills them. But and they started building some wetlands in some low-lying areas for hunting and things like that. But if I fast forward to the 90s, or I came back full-time in 1985, if I fast forward to the 90s, that sort of planting of cypress and things had sort of gone, and we'd been more educated to plant native indigenous species and all that sort of thing. And we upped the plantations and corridors significantly because we saw the value of shelter and increasing the value of the biodiversity that it created as these things grew. And so we did lots and lots of plantings of trees by tree seeding and tube planting where we could. That probably now 15+% of our properties are planted to trees and bushes and things like that, which has been a fun ride. We increased our wetland development partly out of hunting but partly out of a passion, and have a really big complex of wetlands where lots of things breed and carry on. We don't really hunt much anymore, but we still enjoy them. The other thing, in about the late 90s, we got involved with, I have a sort of view a long way out that someday someone will say you can't do that, and we have the Hopkins River that runs diagonally through our properties, and we've got about a 13-kilometre double frontage to that. I thought one day someone's going to tell us we can't graze to the margins. So with some help from Landcare, catchment management authorities, local bodies, we got encouraged to actually fence that out and create riparian strips. And we sowed tree seed on the top margins, right up on top of the bank, and let the river do whatever it wanted. And the river actually replenished itself, band-aided itself, whatever you want, or nature did. It was incredible how quickly that river evolved from being grazed all the way to the centre of it with nothing in it to being an ecosystem on its own with our trees we'd planted on the tops. And that gave us what's a riparian strip. For those that don't know, it's a filter between our farming land and our catchment that flows down to Warrnambool. And it's a really neat spot. Even the fact when Natasha was there, we stood on a bridge we've got, and we've got a little pilot that's not fenced. It's completely grazed all the way to the middle of what it used to be. To me, it's rape and pillage. It looks terrible. Natasha thought it looked quite nice because it was grazed like a lawn all the way down to the water. But then I said, now look over your shoulder to the right and have a look at the river that's been fenced out for, well, what's that? That's 30 years. And see what the ecosystem in there is. So that's a really exciting thing to have on your farm, and having created. The other thing we did nature's a wonderful thing. It delivers you opportunity if you can see it. And in 2011, we had a very wet summer. We pulled out a header out of getting bogged. We don't crop anymore, I think 64 times. That was a little bit of a challenge. But the rain went right through the sort of January, February period, and we had a lot of grass to graze. We weren't moving stock very quickly because we just didn't need to, and we were probably lazy. And we had in a canola crop that had had some chemical treatings the year before, we had red gums coming up in mass amounts. Red gum being a eucalyptus tree, you probably all know it, beautiful tree. And the seeding was all from the grandparent trees. I thought in my lifetime that they might all disappear if we hadn't replanted them, and we tried planting single trees. That wasn't that effective. Anyway, we decided to shut up some significant areas of these red gum reseedings, and now we've got a 40-acre red gum forest and some other fenced-off areas all around the property, which Tash has seen, and they're really fun. My son even got married in them. And all this leads to massive biodiversity. And, you know, we didn't know what we were creating as we created this, but when we were kids, we had pet kangaroos because there were none in the district, not one. Now I could go and I think we found 60 easily. So it's created this biodiversity of kangaroos, wallabies, insects, reptiles, massive birds. Sadly, we don't have a count of what we had before we started, but I can tell you from experience that there's a lot more of different species and things like that we've provided there. But we don't know how to measure it. That's the problem. And what it's worth. It's worth a massive amount. And lots of us in agriculture have done these things, but sadly, because of the time it's been done in this carbon world of today, it's sort of a bit harder to measure. In what we're going to talk about with Bobby, it is measurable in emissions, it's usable in that, but all that carbon we've locked up and put away is sort of gone, and we've been doing the hard work for the country for a long time, a lot of us, but it would almost be in this carbon world be better to buy a blank block and start again now and plant it and do what we've done. But we're pretty proud of what we've done.
I said Tash will lend you the money to do that if you want.
She will.
Yeah.
So there's no back date. We hope we'll get a back date for that one day. We know it's worth a lot. I think that's about me for a start.
Well, look, I think you've covered a lot there, Mark, and it's it really is a testament to the work that you and your family have been doing on farm in southwest Victoria. Certainly, it's one of the farms that I've been on that has really demonstrated some best practice around farm management. And it's a perfect segue back to you, Ange, because we know that in order for our producers to be able to deploy capital into environmental practices, so those things on farm that have an environmental impact, we also need to be able to demonstrate that there's an economic uplift as well. Because we want a thriving, prosperous, successful ag sector that is demonstrating very strong economic outcomes as well as strong environmental outcomes. And I've said many times before that this is an and conversation, it's not an or conversation. How do we support producers, demonstrate good environmental outcomes as well as, and good economic outcomes? So Ange, can you just share a little bit about what you're doing through the Landcare farming workshops and how you're actually supporting producers actually understand that link between productivity, profitability and environment, and maybe share some of the insights that are coming back to you from producers who are doing those workshops?
Thanks, Tash. And I guess what we're doing is working with passionate producers like Mark, who are really keen to, I guess, as Mark said, with our environment, measurement is a really important thing. So we want to be able to measure any of the gains that we're making across, say, biodiversity. So as Mark said, there's been an increase in kangaroos and wallabies and biodiversity on his property. What we need to be able to do for our producers and the questions they're bringing to us is that, how do we measure that? So we've been running workshops that have evolved a bit like Topsy, basically from producers saying, how do we do this? So we've run a series of workshops, for example, with Accounting for Nature across Australia. Actually, the 13th is being run tomorrow near Tamworth, where they've just been one day what we call awareness raising workshops, where we've invited producers and also key influencers. Key influencers are consultants, Landcare facilitators, departmental staff, just people that are there in that role between the producer and government and research to actually get the message across. So we're actually working with them so they better understand how we can measure biodiversity on their properties so that they can start using that on an everyday basis in their business. So we talk about operationalising things. So with Ruminati, for example, they've got a great platform that producers are very well aware of. How do we operationalise that so they use it every day? The same with Accounting for Nature. So we're actually making people aware of that platform, which they're basing it on international standards of biodiversity measurement. So how can they operationalise that, actually use it on an everyday basis on their property to measure their biodiversity? So the Landcare farming program has been working with producers now for about 4 years. We've probably touched about over 2,000 producers. We started out doing a kind of a desktop review around biodiversity and carbon. So 600 odd producers got in and said, we'd like to know more about biodiversity on our farms or carbon on our farms. This is about 4 years ago this started. And we did like a desktop review with supported by facilitators and key influencers. And the data that came out of that, out of both of those separate groups, was pretty much generally, it was around they wanted greater clarity around their actions. So they were interested in learning more about the carbon market, or carbon generally. They were interested in learning more about biodiversity, but they needed to know more, they wanted to know more. And Earlier today, the chap, Tim, who's the fellow that did the Shackleton adventure?
Tim Jarvis.
Sorry, Tim Jarvis. I'm very bad with names. Tim Jarvis talked about how commitment started with clarity. So we're talking. So producers want to commit to looking after their land better, commit to engaging in all this new stuff that we find out through our research. But they need clarity to do that. So they want a greater clarity around action. So that's where we then, stepped in, and with the accounting for nature work that we've done, even though there's environmental markets are still evolving, or biodiversity markets, but the producers, it's a slightly different language for primary producers. And I say primary producers because I grew up in a grazing family, and if my mum and dad were called farmers, it was kind of an insult, like they weren't sodbusters. Sorry, Mark. But, so the primary producers is both of those audiences. They want to know how they can, measure what's happening on farms. So we're supporting producers in that, and we've now run from all of that work we've done, we've also run 13 what we call producer trials. So on their properties, they've actually been trialling and testing some of the questions they've got around carbon and around biodiversity. And we will continue to do that. And even today, with the conversations I've had with Mark and Bobby, because we're all very well invested, Mark from the producer end, and then Bobby from that organisational end, and then Landcare Australia, we've got a role here because we're federal and because we can be agnostic. So we work with all producers across all industries. We can work with our Landcare facilitators. We work with all of the departments. We work with Ruminati. We work with SIBO Labs. We work with all these organisations to support our producers to make the outcome better for the producer and for the land. And the amazing thing about it, and Mark and I did talk about it earlier, and I'm surprised you didn't say it, Mark, but what we said was, isn't nature amazing? Not that long ago, 100 years ago, primary producers were paid to ring bark their trees. That's what the government said. Do lots of ring barking. We'll pay you to ring bark all the trees. And obviously we now realise that's not the right way to go. But because we're planting trees, producers like Mark have been doing it generationally, we're actually bringing our landscape back. And nature is amazing in that it does recover if you support it. And so going forward, we just want to support the Landcare Australia program, wants to support producers to engage with opportunities like with Ruminati to actually measure emissions, manage their soil better, manage their land better, graze better, look after their animals better, and make sure that our consumers, and there's quite a few consumers probably in this audience, can be comfortable with buying food and fibre from the Australian agricultural industries, knowing that our industry, actually, we're world leaders in a lot of the things that we do, and we don't celebrate that enough. We actually are world leaders in sustainability. So our consumers should be pretty comfortable and going, okay, well, these guys are continue to do the best that they can to manage their land really well, manage their landscapes, to produce the clothes that we wear and the food that we eat every day. Because let's face it, if it wasn't for primary producers, we'd all be sitting here naked and hungry, wouldn't we? We'd have no clothes, we'd have no food. So just think about that. So we sort of need to acknowledge that these people are generally trying to do the very best that they can and be thankful that you've got clothes and food.
I think that's so right, Ange. There's so much to be proud of in Australian agriculture, and certainly through our experiences, we know, and I'm going to pass to you now, Bobby, because we know that Australian producers are deeply curious about what is happening in transition, how they can maximise the opportunities that are available through what is a major transformation in Australian agriculture, how they can manage the risks, and what their role is to play in what's going to be happening in coming years. But along with that deep curiosity, there is also some confusion. So what is it that I should be doing? What are the best practices that would apply to my farm? How can I get engaged? And so, Bobby, I'm going to ask you a little bit about what we've been doing in the pilot, but firstly, maybe if you can just share, how is Ruminati leaning into that problem and really tackling this issue of providing clarity, as Ange said, to Australian producers?
Yeah, thanks, Tash. Put simply in a word, the answer to that question is measurement. You can't improve what you can't measure. One of the quotes that we came across early in the piece was Carl Pearson. He says, that which is measured improves, and that which is measured and reported improves exponentially. And so we thought, well, let's not try and get involved with how they're going to do it. Let's just start the reporting mechanism going. And so the first thing we then identified as producers, and with my livestock producer hat on, we sort of said, okay, well, all of this activity at the corporate, at the industry body level was sort of manifesting itself in targets, reductions targets. And that's not just for ag. Any business in the world needs to be accountable for their emissions. They need to measure and report on what they're doing. But in our specific industry, food and fibre, most of those emissions we were learning were on farm. It's what's called Scope 3. The industry Scope 3s are our Scope 1s. And so if the industry, the banks and the companies that buy our food and fibre and lend us money, were going to make progress towards their targets, we would have to make progress on reducing our emissions. And so what's the first thing you need to do to make progress? You need to measure. So how do we measure? And what we came across was there was nothing to make it easy and accurate for farmers to measure their emissions. And now there was a whole bunch of other things that came out of that about education and, like you said, the confusion. I think whenever there's a new movement or a new paradigm shift, there's always confusion, because there's people that come out and try and commercialise it with different products. The government has a crack and usually messes it up. Industry bodies put their 2 bobs in, and farmers just end up confused, saying, I was doing a soil thing and someone told me to plant trees, but now my cows are bad and bug it, I'm just going to disengage. And so we saw it as our role to try and come at this from the farmer's point of view, from a producer's point of view, Tanj, and say, you know, approach it with a lens sympathetic to the workload the farmers already have. There's a big compliance burden. We're having to be land managers, fencers, tractor drivers, HR, accountants, and now we have to be carbon accountants. And so basically what we did is said, well, let's make a tool that's online, free and easy for farmers just to start, just to get their data, put it online and get their first baseline and see what that is. And we tested that with producers, and the feedback on the process and the UX was great, but we got a lot of questions back. The process of doing their first baseline really asked more questions than it answered. And those questions fell into 2 broad categories: so what and who cares? And so we said, right, well, there's our next 2 bits of work, answering that question, so what and who cares? So what is, a baseline is, as I understand it from working with the banks in the supply chain, it's not something that producers are going to be held to and taxed or penalised because of. It's a reference point. It's a starting point to say, I did my baseline in 2023 or 24 with the CBA pilot, and that's my starting point. And looking forward now, over the coming years, I'm going to proceed with my production with my emissions as part of my decision-making paradigm. And even better, I'm going to start to figure out how I can reduce my emissions over time by undertaking certain activities. And so we built what's called a reduction planner, which is where a farmer, based on the information that we've just received for their baseline, can make a plan specific for their own operation on how they'll either increase sequestration or reduce emissions to push down the net emissions line over time. And so that we sort of hoped answered the question, so what, from the producer's point of view. Who cares? Well, you care, Tash, right? Because everyone's, that, as I said, lends us money or buys our product has set a reduction target. The biggest emission they have, particularly in beef, in all of these businesses, is Scope 3 from the farm. And so we need to be able to get a way to get that data from the farm and, what we say, give it a meaningful life. It doesn't just sit on a server or on a desktop somewhere and get dusted off the next time you have to do it, but share that into the supply chain, be it the bank, be it the feedlot, the processor, the retailer, the people who are interested in that data, so they can act on it, so they can come up with incentive structures or potentially penalty structures, or allocate capital to reduce emissions at the farm level to help them achieve their target. So that's how we're tackling it, Tash.
And I'm going to stay with you for a moment because it's been really interesting what we've learned from the pilot, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that we want to support farmers or support producers through transition. Make sure that they've got every opportunity to maximise the opportunities that transition will bring, but also to manage the risks, and make sure they've got the information that they need in order to continue to be successful, both economically and environmentally. And I think you've touched on a few things there. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Mark, but I'm just going to share some of the insights and talk about what we've learned from the pilot, because Mark actually participated in the pilot. So a producer who's already at the very sophisticated end of implementing best practice farm management has also got some value here. So I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Mark. But in the meantime, I'm going to stay with you, Bobby, and say that we know, certainly at CommBank, we recognise that every farm is going to be starting from a different point. We know that each producer is going to have its own goals, is going to have its own opportunities, and is going to have its own activities through the period of transition. But as a sector, we really want to help move the conversation forward, and we want to build momentum to accelerate that conversation and actually help producers get started. So hearing from Ange around clarity, knowing that many of our primary producing clients are deeply curious but also somewhat confused, knowing that Ruminati had an online emissions calculator that we could use, we set up a pilot. So our pilot comprised about 50 customers from across the east coast of Australia, so mainly livestock and mixed farming producers from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania last week. And those producers came together in a workshop with Ruminati and CommBank to be able to calculate their baseline emissions, but more importantly, to actually think about what activities they could undertake or what their options are, keeping in mind that the number is only the first step. So really what we want to do is highlight what the activities could be, what the options might be, what the opportunities will be, and how we can actually link activities that might be very good for environmental outcomes to also demonstrate that there's an economic output as well. So, Bobby, we know that when we started the pilot, about 86% of the customers who participated in the pilot had never undertaken a baseline emissions calculation before. Some had started it and had abandoned it because it was too confusing. We know that over 70% of those on the pilot undertook the pilot and engaged with the pilot because they were very keen to understand more. They wanted to learn from a trusted partner like their bank, to think about the trends that were coming their way and to really engage in transition. We also knew that about 30% of those that were participating in the pilot were engaged because they actually understood that supply chain was asking questions. And so in order to be able to meet supply chain expectations, to remain with market access, to take advantage of new markets, to be able to talk about their supply chain with confidence, they needed to get started and learn more. So, Bobby, I'm going to ask you now, you've conducted, I think you were involved in almost all of the workshops that we did with our pilot customers. Would love to hear your insights about, so what did they say, what did they learn, what value did they share with you?
Yep.
And then I'm going to come to you, Mark, because as someone that we've got over a 70-year relationship with, I think the relationship goes back to 1932. I'm going to ask you about what you got out of the pilot and some of the insights that you've got. So, Bobby, I'd love to hear from you first around the workshops that we did right across Eastern Australia.
Thank you, Tash. Look, it was a busy schedule. I think we covered off 12 offices in 2 weeks, basically. I've got more frequent flyer miles now than I've ever had before. But, you know, it was a great process because we were introduced to the farmers, as you say, under the auspices of working with the bank, which gives a level of confidence. And, you know, just looking at the cross-section of producers, I think there was one at the elder age was 75, down to, there was a number of, I know your son was there, Mark, there's a number of second-generation farmers coming through. So it appealed to all ages, and the level of interest correlated just as well across all age groups, I think I'd say. Basically, like you said, Tash, they all are there because they want to have a clear path forward. And I think what we're selling at Ruminati, as much as software, is confidence. Here's something you can do that is going to sort of stand you in good stead for the future. It's low impost, it's based on the right science, and you can trust us to have your back. I think that was a bit of a takeaway I took away from the producers talking to them at the end of it. They felt more confident in their understanding of their own business, in their understanding of the levers they could pull and what impact they would have. There's one or two furphies we dispelled along the way, that if I do this, then I'll have to do that, or I'll get penalised, or I'll get taxed, or whatnot. But generally, I think even the most, let's say, gruff, climate-denying, anti-type farmers, sort of the thing they say to us, it's all BS. Anyway, how do we do it? They've come across the hoop, and I don't think there is many left in the farming community that are saying, well, no, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to participate. What there is a bit of a lacking at the moment is the why, and I think because it is so new, we're still trying to figure that out. What is the bank going to do with this information? What is the supply chain going to do with this information? And the answer we honestly have to go back to them is, well, they don't know, because they don't have the information yet. That's what we're trying to work out. So we're really at the front end of this process. And I think what they appreciate is the honesty and candour. Being able to say, look, I don't know, because they don't know, is a lot better than saying, do this and you can sell credits for millions, when, you know, there's a fair bit under that statement. So, and I think one of the things to touch on, one of your catch guys, Tash, of the triple bottom line, is that all of the activities that correlate with lower emissions production, are strongly correlated with high productivity and high profitability. I'll give you two quick examples. Animals that are more fertile and grow quicker produce less emissions per kilo of beef. Simple as that. They're on the planet for a short amount of time before they're killed, and there's less wastage in terms of the reproductive cycle. Same with soil. Soil that has higher soil organic carbon retains more moisture, cycles more nutrients, grows more grass. The grass is more highly digestible, it turns off more kilos. There aren't many levers that you pull that are antagonistic to profit and profitability and production. But we need to show that in data. Farmers, call BS when you stand up on stage and say that without something to back it up. And so as we've started to bring these data sets in, we say, okay, look here. So if you do a soil project here and plant trees there, that's reducing your emissions, you create shelter belts, so your land survival goes up, your soil carbon's going to go up. It's a win-win-win. There were two examples that I'll talk to specifically. One was a producer at Moree who was cropping his country, and he'd cleared a bit that was sort of at a big nature verge. And suckling trees were coming through. So every year or two he would have to get 2 dozers and clear this whole back set of country. Cost him about $60,000 to $70,000, I think. So we said, well, if you just lock that up and let it grow, that offsets most of the rest of your operation. So you're saving $60,000 to $70,000, and you can go to Pure Grain or Croker's, whoever's supplying grains into the mills or into the alcohol companies, and say, well, my product is lower emissions. How can you help me with that? The other one was a lamb producer in Tasmania at the pilot we're at last week. He'd done soil tests on 2 paddocks right next to each other. One had been heavily improved, was a very productive irrigated flat, turning off fat lambs at a rate of knots. The other one was native country. There's a fence between it, and that hadn't had anything done. And there was about a 1% difference in soil organic carbon. So we put that into the reduction planner, and we said, okay, well, if you take this parcel of land and do the same here, which is right next door, so it's not out of the realms of possibility, how much would that create in terms of carbon credits? And if you retire that against your operation, what reduction does that then infer across your whole business? And it was 4.5% across their whole business from a 25 hectare paddock on a 1,200 hectare farm. Now, the only problem he had is he didn't have the money to do it at the moment. So it was the first lead to come out of the pilot for the Agri-Green loan. But without fishing for them, we didn't go looking for these things. These are activities and genuine cross-sections of the triple bottom line, as you say, that popped up out of the process. And that's out of 50 producers put through in a pilot. So our hypothesis is if we can move to having a quarter, half, 3/4, all of Australia's farmers baseline, imagine all the activities that will come out of that need funding, that are going to lead to increased sustainability and produce more food and fibre.
Terrific, and I think it's a perfect segue to you, Mark, because as we've talked about, we've enjoyed a long-standing relationship with the Gubbins family, dating back to 1932, I think, and you were at the front end, you're at the pointy end of implementing best farm practices, but you still really engaged heavily with the pilot. And so I'd be really keen to hear from you. We've got sort of a few minutes left, but really keen to hear from you. What was it that attracted you to take part? What value did you get out of it? And what do you see yourself doing with it now that you've done the workshop?
Okay, so I think I said in my interlude that we as a family look ahead, 5, 10, 20 years. And if you look at the industry at the moment and you look at what's going on in the world with everything in carbon and everything like that, you have to look ahead. We could stick our head in the sand and go, oh, bugger it, we're not going to do anything. But that's not the point. The point is we have to be proactive. We have to have the answer to the question before it gets asked. And we had for some time been sitting down going, where do we enter this area? What is the method that we enter with? When you turn it back 3 or 4 years, we'd probably go, oh, we're going to sell everything. We're going to sell carbon here and carbon there and make a fortune and get our boat on the Caribbean. Not possible. That's called offsetting. We're into insetting. We want to keep what we've got. But what have we got? Where do we start? And so that's what it was. And our relationship with the bank over a long period of time had been in conversations about all these things that you had going on, and we were asked if we'd like to enter the Ruminati pilot, and we agreed, and it's been a really great outcome, I think. We were prepped well. We had the data to go into the room with Bobby, so we knew what we had to enter in the system that made it a lot easier than sitting there going, how do I do this, how do I do that? So our bank account manager prepped us really well. but actually entering the data into your model was really easy. It was in our questions, farmer questions, or farmer language, and click of a button, you get an outcome. Did we like the outcome? Don't know, but it is a baseline. We've got to start. We've got something we can work with and do. And interesting out of that, I think one of the part of the question was, what are we going to do with it? Well, already we've sat down with their, it's not your calculator, your...
Reduction planner.
Reduction planner. We've gone, if we planted trees here, what would it do? If we did this, what would it do? If we do that, this other thing, what would we do? We've also gone back to our lick producer. We use licks for sheep and cattle to do certain things to balance their mineral output. We've said, can you put seaweed in here? Well, they're going to go and find out about that, but at least the conversation's being had. We talked about early turn-off production. That's a really interesting one for us. I told you about the Coorong country we have. It is really good production country, and we first bought the first place there in 2006, and then 2011, we went from calf turn-off rates, kilo a head rates of sort of 1.25 at best to high 2s, with maybe some genetics, but also the country, the type of country. So can we do more there? I don't know if we can do more. You can always do more, but there are things that it's made us think about with a little bit of data that we've got. We've already got the data, inputting it into a calculator that actually gave us something we could use. And to you guys, I reckon it's really good. It's going to develop, I think, further, and I think it's going to be a really good tool for agriculture to use and move forward and enter this whole space that is somewhat quite frightening.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really wonderful to hear those insights, Mark. I think we could easily chat for another half an hour, probably an hour, to really delve into some of the practices that are available to producers to both optimise both economic and environmental outcomes. But I think what's clear from our conversation today is that the conversation shifted. I used to talk 2 years ago about momentum starting to accelerate. I think there's no doubt now that the conversation's shifted and momentum has accelerated. Producers are moving from curiosity and some confusion, but towards intent, and from intent towards action. And we've seen that reflected in the comments that you made, Ange, about what Landcare farming is doing, Bobby, the work that you're doing with Ruminati, but importantly, the work that producers like yourself, Mark, are doing on the front line to support us produce the food and fibre that we need and to really impact emitting less, sequestering carbon and rebuilding natural capital. I think it's really clear at CommBank that we're here to support producers to really navigate that successful pathway through transition, to make the most of the opportunities that are evident and to really manage the risks. We're seeing this as an enormous opportunity for primary producers to achieve both economic and environmental outcomes, and for producers to successfully unlock what we're calling that new triple bottom line of productivity, profitability and sustainability. Would you please thank all of our panellists today for sharing their insights. Thank you very much.